Welcome to this podcast from the Medical Journal of Australia. My name is Sally Block, the MJA's news and online editor. The MJA acknowledges the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we live and work across Australia. This podcast was recorded on the lands of the Wangal people. I pay my respects to their elders past and present. This week is NAIDOC week, and the MJA is publishing a special collection of articles that are Indigenous-led and authored. To learn more about the collection, I'm joined by guest editors, Ms Sophie Pitt, a Meriam Torres Strait Islander woman, Dr Stephen Harfield, a proud Narungga and Ngarrindjeri man, and Associate Professor Paul Saunders, a proud Biripi man. What drew you to step into the guest editorial role for this collection?
So I think for me, in the context of why the guest editorial role is important, I think from the perspective of our team, and you guys feel free to add on or correct me, I think it's really important to have a space within a mainstream academic publishing where Indigenous researchers and community voices are heard and validated and respected. But for me personally, I'm very, very early in my research career. So I was incredibly happy to have the opportunity to be able to have this experience and learn from some really accomplished and incredible Indigenous academics. So from a personal perspective, I felt very lucky to be part of this team.
Paul or Stephen, do you want to add to that?
I'd probably just say that it's a great opportunity in terms of, I think, for the Medical Journal of Australia to really take on and to provide the opportunity for the the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research community, but also the broader community to kind of have the special issue. I think is a great initiative, but also to support, people such as ourselves to be guest editors, particularly for a journal such as the MJA, where these opportunities may not always be available. And so I think it's there's the broader impact that it has in terms of, translating and putting the evidence out there for the broader community, but I also think it's about capacity building, and the fact that the Medical Journal of Australia can contribute to capacity building for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people I think is great.
Paul, did you want to add to that?
Look, all I would add is that the opportunity for Indigenous peoples to take ownership of a mainstream issue is really, really important, because I think what it does is it allows, as Stephen mentioned, the mainstream readership of the Medical Journal of Australia to really understand what are the key research priorities as identified by Indigenous peoples, how is research conducted in a culturally appropriate way, but also it provides an opportunity for other research stakeholders, whether they be journals or otherwise, to look in to see what was the process that the MJA adopted and how successful was that and why was it successful. So I think it's really important as almost a role model type scenario for the journal.
What was the narrative or gap in the existing literature you felt had to be addressed?
I think that historically in research, and in particular in medical and health research, the focus has been on deficits. The disadvantage or disparity or dysfunction in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. However, we know as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples that the I guess gold standard or the best practice for doing research with and for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities is to take a strengths-based approach to research and to have community-driven and self-determined focuses for the projects that we're doing research within. So I think the narrative shift between that deficit frame that historically has really been pronounced within medical and health research to ensuring that the articles that we were letting through were ones that were using strengths language and really focusing on strengths of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, I think was something that I thought would be really important to ensure through this process.
And Stephen or Paul, do you want to add to that?
For me, it was really about privileging the voices and knowledges of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I think that's one of the additional benefits as well of the special issue, is that we really get to hear from our communities And I think it provides us a lens and an opportunity to have that greater understanding of the lived experiences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And so I think being able to privilege those voices, knowledges, and knowledge holders is a great way of us contributing to the broader evidence around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health and wellbeing.
I also think that this opportunity allows, as I mentioned, Indigenous ownership over research publication, which is something that has historically been, completely lacking in terms of no opportunities. We have an opportunity within this special issue to ensure that not just Indigenous voices be platformed, Indigenous methodologies be platformed and privileged, but also that there is Indigenous control over what is deemed important and what is deemed appropriate for publication and dissemination. So there's greater access to these Indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing, being and doing through this process.
Thanks, Paul. What were you looking for in the submissions to ensure the collection prioritised strength-based, community-led narratives?
I think for me, especially being quite early in my career as a researcher, I really leaned on some of the frameworks and systems, I guess, that have been developed and designed and embedded by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander academics and communities that had come before, because I think it's important that we're utilising those effectively in these spaces to be able to make sure that the research is aligned with what has been developed by communities and embedded by communities previously. I think it was really important for us to look for evidence of community involvement within not just the research itself, but also the governance of the research and trying to make sure that Indigenous ways of knowing, being and doing and Indigenous leadership was embedded across all aspects of the research.
And just to add, I think it's also about not only just privileging the voices of communities and our researchers, but also the methods, the methodologies, the research practices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as a way of facilitating that strength-based, community-led narrative.
So how did you balance maintaining the rigorous standards of a major medical journal while honouring and validating Indigenous ways of knowing, being and doing?
I think for me, I sort of reframed rigour a little bit. So I think for us, it was, as much as it is extremely important for, papers and research that's published to be grounded in, good, rigorous scientific methodologies. I think that when we're looking at this research with an Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander lens, I think the rigour also extends to what we sort of previously discussed around is this done in the way that is appropriate and safe and really privileges the voices of the people that we believe it's important to privilege. So I think sometimes within the Western journals and the Western ways of doing, Indigenous health is seen as sort of, in inverted commas, a soft science, and priority is placed on, in inverted commas, the hard sciences to ensure that papers are meeting the rigour that they're supposed to. But I think from our perspective, that rigour was then sort of extended, and our priorities were with both the rigour of the methodology, which is extremely important, but also the rigour of the Indigenous, research methodologies that are different, but just as important.
Stephen or Paul, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, for me, I think when I think about this, it's, and not only do we meet the standards of, a journal such as the Medical Journal of Australia, but we also put in place additional standards that I think raise the bar in a way. A requirement of submitting an article to the journal was, that it had to be led, or, the first or senior author had to be Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. And, we also required that there was, authors provided a positionality statement to outline their positionality in terms of who they are as researchers, but also to, identify that there was Indigenous governance in place. And so I think, by raising the bar, we ensure that particularly the work that is coming forward is of the best quality, and I think that's a way of ensuring that, you know, we're validating Indigenous ways of knowing, being and doing by having that Indigenous involvement and leadership throughout the research process.
Thanks, Stephen. Paul, did you want to add to that?
Oh, look, my thoughts exactly. I think that our standards go above and beyond traditional, you know, scientific-based Western research in that we have to ensure that type of rigour while also ensuring that it is community-informed, community-led, led by Indigenous peoples. And so the added layer of not just receiving ethics for a research project, but also ensuring that there's appropriate Indigenous governance. What does that look like? So I actually agree that our standards go beyond what would normally be considered, because we have those additional layers on top that really strengthen the overall rigour when considering the context of Indigenous health research.
When evaluating community programs, how do you ensure that the metrics for success are defined by the community itself rather than imposed by external academic or funding institutions?
To relate it to healthcare, I think much of the time in healthcare, we look at clinical success as, more of a diagnostic criteria. You know, is someone's blood pressure meeting a particular standard, and what do the numbers look like? And I think a lot of the time in research, that can sort of seem the same. However, we know in healthcare that the measure of success is not just whether someone's blood pressure is within normal range. There's, so many other aspects of health that go into whether or not there has been a successful healthcare journey. And I think that it's the same with research. I think that sure, we can look at research as, from a Western lens of being a scientific success. But I think if we expand that out, we also need to ensure that the research that we're publishing and that we're putting out there is successful by the metrics that are designed by the communities in which the research actually ends up impacting. So I think ensuring that, like I sort of mentioned, that we're using those metrics and frameworks that are designed by the community in order to measure the success of the research that's going to be impacting that community just sort of makes sense.
Just adding on from the previous question as well, in terms of just rigour and standards, one of the other things we did was ask authors to report against the consolidated criteria for strengthening the reporting of health involving Indigenous people, the consider statement. And so that's a set of criteria that assesses, or that authors are asked to report on in terms of research that does involve Indigenous people, where they identify how they've met standards in relation to governance, relationships, prioritisation, methodologies, participation, capacity, analysis and findings, and dissemination. So that criteria kind of helps maintain, or at least provides a framework for reporting how authors and the research has gone about conducting that research, particularly in terms of, ensuring community has been involved in all aspects of the research. And so I think tools such as that are really great for kind of pushing back or facilitating community's involvement in terms of, often the practices of, academics or other funding institutions in terms of having to do things in a particular way. It's really about empowering communities to be involved and to have, oversight, governance and leadership in this space.
I was reflecting while Soph and Stephen were talking as well, and just the notion of metrics is a very Westernized approach to evaluation and research. I think our number one indicator of success is community feedback, and often that is in a qualitative nature, and often that provides the rich data that we're able to analyse and determine whether or not something is successful. And also defining success is also interesting as well, because it's not always a reduction in blood pressure or a reduction in cholesterol or whatever it may be. There may be unforeseen benefits in terms of impacts on social and emotional well-being if it's a community health project. So I think we determine success with quite a holistic lens as well, and we're not as targeted and defined to a particular group of metrics or whatever that may be. So I think that even just the conception of some of these terms is completely different within the context of Indigenous research.
How crucial is the conversation around Indigenous data sovereignty, especially regarding how long data is retained and who ultimately controls it?
I think that it's really a non-negotiable that Indigenous data is owned and cared for by Indigenous peoples and communities. I think historically data around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples has sort of been weaponised or used to advance careers or for personal or group gain. And I think ultimately if the communities who were the ones who provided that data, which, as Paul mentioned, a lot of the time is qualitative data that is very rich in either Indigenous knowledges or lived experiences. I think that data should then be held respectfully by the communities that provided it. And I think the further that we move towards that being a non-negotiable and really the only way that things are done, the better we're going to see in research outcomes in the future.
Stephen, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'd probably just add that it's just really important in the sense that communities have control and governance over data that is about them, and that they're able to determine who uses and accesses that data, but also in the way in which that data is presented or translated in the broader community. It's about ensuring that, ultimately that data represents and respects the individuals who that data is about, and that those researchers or individuals that use that data are accountable to those communities that the data is about.
Yeah, I'll just mention that Indigenous data sovereignty was a topic of conversation between the guest editorial team for this special collection regarding a number of submissions, and it wasn't always negative. I think it was just a conversation that we had as the guest editorial team, which in my opinion is good because it means that we've not just considered it, but considered it as quite something important. And some of the conversations were quite in depth, and particularly the tension around community control over their data, and then the auspicing research institutions that like to control research data, and how do we navigate that, I guess, and how do Indigenous researchers and non-Indigenous researchers navigate that complexity. And I think that that's a really important notion for researchers, Indigenous or otherwise, that are involved in Indigenous research to really, really consider from the outset. And the conception of the research is who's going to own this data, who's going to control it, who's going to have access to it, and where is it going to be retained and everything else. So these are really, really important questions that we probably often take for granted, and particularly non-Indigenous researchers that are just involved in mainstream research. It's always just this protocol that's held by a research institution that you need to abide by, but doesn't necessarily reflect the sovereignty of the communities in which that research is being extracted from in many cases.
When reviewing the submissions, what common systemic barriers did you notice researchers are still consistently experiencing in the research space?
I think, and we saw a little bit of this, and I think we probably spoke about it a little bit in one of the earlier questions, but I think the priority that's placed on Western frameworks of research can still certainly be a systemic barrier within the research space, that sometimes Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ways of researching and methodologies aren't valued or acknowledged as true scientific research in the way that they should. And yeah, I think sometimes sometimes when we look at how papers are reviewed by non-Indigenous reviewers, you can sort of see that the priority is placed in the parts of the research that, fits in with their worldview. And sometimes things are, I guess, framed in a way by non-Indigenous researchers that can certainly be perceived as through a deficit lens, rather than really utilising the strengths of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research methodologies as a priority.
When we privilege Indigenous voices and use Indigenous methodologies, ultimately they're a form of resistance and challenging Western approaches and systems. And often that can be a challenge in this space, particularly when, for example, when the work's being reviewed by non-Indigenous people who may not entirely understand the greater context or even those methodologies that are being used. And so I think, again, one of the benefits of this issue was the fact that as guest editors, we could privilege those voices. And often, at times, some of these articles may not, for whatever reason, pass through a standard review process for a journal, whether it's the MJA or another journal, just because there isn't that involvement of Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander or Indigenous people in that process. And so I think that's one of also the additional benefits of this special issue, is privileging those voices, because that can be quite a challenge for authors at times, is that there's often pushback from reviewers who don't quite understand their approach or what they're trying to do in terms of using or including language or methods or practices that challenge those Western paradigms. And so I think that's a barrier and a challenge that we're probably going to continue to face for quite some time until there are enough Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to be involved in the review process.
From our experience as the guest editorial team, it was the peer review process and just the lack of volume in terms of Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander reviewers. And often we were earmarking, the same person a few times for a few different papers, but knowing that, there's the balance between ensuring rigorous review through an Indigenous lens, but also ensuring that we're not putting too much burden on people that are already overburdened in many cases as well.
What would be the counter to that? Like, what would you be calling for so that next time round more people to be able to be involved?
I don't know that there's a solution for getting more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander researchers on board, because I think the cohort is only so big. I don't think that we're going to be able to expand that easily over time. I'm sure that it will, naturally. But I think what we sort of discussed is identifying potential non-Indigenous reviewers that we know have an understanding of Indigenous research methodologies and are, I guess, positive allies to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander researchers in a way that they understand the way that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research is framed in a way that problematises the system rather than the people. And I think that was probably one of the main blockers that we came against, was I think that non-Indigenous reviewers appeared to struggle a little bit with the strong language that's used in some of these papers around calling out the system as a real issue. And I think if we can find non-Indigenous academics and researchers that have an understanding and an awareness of those methodologies and those perspectives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and identify them quite quickly so that we can get papers out to them, I think that was sort of one of the solutions that we came up with.
Probably just to add that at times I think the review process from a journal perspective probably just needs to be a bit more flexible to allow greater involvement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander or Indigenous people to review. Often the quick turnaround of 2 to 4 weeks isn't sufficient enough, given the capacity and the burden that academics and researchers in this space often carry, wearing multiple hats, but also just their limited capacity. But I think it's really important that we ensure that where possible that research involving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander or other Indigenous populations has review by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people or Indigenous people, just so it ensures that there is greater voice and support for those authors and papers that do come through.
Yeah, and we tried to somewhat address the capacity issue this year by extending it to a special collection as opposed to a special issue that we did in the previous year or years, just to ensure that all of the papers didn't need to be ready for publication prior to NAIDOC week. But I guess the flip side of that is that we received more publications as well. So it sort of allowed us to spread that burden throughout a few more months of the year as opposed to just cramming it all into the first half of the year. But I think in terms of the reviewer capacity issue, I'm not sure what else we could do, really. I mean, capacity is capacity, and I think, as Soph said, I think there's the logical step is to look for those allies that are well versed in Indigenous research methodologies, have been involved in Indigenous research projects, are those true allies, and that's who we need to lean on.
If non-Indigenous policymakers, clinicians and researchers read this collection, what is the single most important lesson you want them to absorb about their role in Indigenous health?
I think it's probably very similar to the most important thing that I tell students, non-Indigenous students in medicine, when they practice, when they go out and practice, is it's about relinquishing control. I think the most important thing that you should take from this as a non-Indigenous health professional in any context is understanding the importance of self-determination in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and healthcare, and being okay with not being the expert in something. And I think that's something especially in medical fields, that people really struggle with. I think that you're trained for many, many years to be the expert in your field, and if you are a non-Indigenous person, you're never going to be the expert in this field. Even us as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, even though it's part of our expertise, we are not the be-all and end-all or the number one expert in any of our fields. It's always about having respect and accountability and responsibility to our communities to ensure that everything that we do is determined by them, for the people that, these things are impacting on a day-to-day basis. So I think from a non-Indigenous perspective, you really should be taking a step back and allowing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to self-determine how they want their, research to look, how they want their papers to look, how they want their healthcare to look. I think that's absolutely the most important part of any aspect of Indigenous health and wellbeing, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I would agree with Sophie. I think it's also about non-Indigenous people reflecting on how they can be a good ally in this space. How can I, as a non-Indigenous person, reflect on how I facilitate or support Indigenous-led research or health and wellbeing, and how can I build the capacity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people or Indigenous people to be self-determining in this space?
Yeah. I think the notion that Sophie and Stephen have really touched on, beyond self-determination and allyship, is really centering this notion of cultural humility as Sophie mentioned, it's a core quality that medical and other health practitioners need to practice when seeing or working with Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander peoples, whether that be in a healthcare context or a research context. This notion that you're a learner, you're humble and you're open to alternative perspectives about research, whether they be methodologies or otherwise, and really creating a partnership between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, whether they be co-researchers, participants that are or aren't co-researchers, depending on your methodological approach. And just really, I think humbleness goes a long way. We talk about being respectful, we talk about being kind and compassionate, but humbleness underpins a lot of all of that. And I think within the context of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research, cultural humility, practicing that and being responsive really enhances the likelihood of a culturally safe encounter and outcome for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples that are involved in the research that you're a part of as well.
For Indigenous researchers who are stepping into academic publishing, what is one piece of advice you would give them about navigating the peer review and editorial systems?
I think that my advice would be to be, stand firm in your methodologies and in your space, I guess, as an Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander researcher. I think the risk of working within these systems and being in these systems for lengthy periods of time as an Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander person is that you can feel pushed into either, adopting deficit sort of narratives or adopting more westernised approaches to research that don't necessarily align with who you are and your experience and your lens as an Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander person. So I guess it would be that, Indigenous research methodologies are not just valid, but I think they should be prioritised. And if you feel like they are not being, there are certainly other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander academics out there that feel the same way or that have a lot of experience in these systems and are able to support you in that space because our ways of knowing, being and doing are valid and really should be celebrated. And not just that, I think that they should probably, these kind of methodologies that we use, it would be really good if they were adopted more broadly into non-Indigenous research. We know that they work really well, having research that's led by or governed by communities in which they impact. And I think that sometimes we end up feeling like a little invalidated by Western systems. So I guess just words of encouragement that, your methodologies and the way that you do things are valid and should be prioritised and celebrated within the space because they work.
I think for me, it's about the review process should always be strength-based. It's a way of, getting constructive feedback on the work that you're doing. And so I think every effort should be made as a reviewer to really provide constructive feedback that improves the publication or the manuscript. And I think as a new researcher coming to this space or publishing for the first time, particularly as a first author, it can be quite a daunting process. But often it's we all face rejection in some form or another. And so this is, another space that it does happen, but really the review process should be strength-based. And so it should be seen as, receiving constructive feedback that improves your publication, your manuscript. And so it's a way of improving on that translation of the work that you've done.
There's a few words that come to my mind when we're discussing this, and that's resilience, bravery and courage. I mean, we are contesting, taken for granted approaches to research that lie outside of what would be considered the norm in the research sphere. So, there's a level of courage that you need and resilience that you need, and it's definitely for the rejection. I think all of us get rejected at some point within a research context and a publication context. But it's about having the resilience and having the bravery as well to be able to, if you're questioned by a reviewer, and you truly believe that is part of your way of knowing, being and doing, or it's something that the community in which you've been a part of has really is part of their lived experience or their truth, then I think the bravery and the courage to challenge that or to assert that if it is challenged is really, really important. Beyond that, I think it's a tough space. I think it's a tough space to publish in. It's a tough space to review. So, yeah, look, I do think that there is a level of bravery and courage that's needed and resilience that's needed to persist and to succeed in this space.
That's a great one to end on, Paul. Indeed. Thank you to my special guests, Ms Sophie Pitt, Dr Stephen Harfield and Associate Professor Paul Saunders. You can find more podcasts on our website at mja.com.au or wherever you find your podcasts. Thank you so much for listening.